Yep.
So now let's get into the fun stuff. Real steroids.
Yeah, so real steroids, I guess, other than dutasteride and finasteride, which I do not take during fertility phases. When I am on my, let's consider it health phase, I want to keep my Lp(a) low. My starting Lp(a) was around 100 nanomoles per liter. Yep. And I've gotten it down to into the 20s. Sometimes it goes into the 30s. In general, when I'm on my health phase, it's around 70 to 140 milligrams a week of.
Now, we'll turn it over to you. I assume that you're taking the same dose of creatine just like everyone else.
So not taking the same dose of creatine, but I might completely alter this regimen because I've been taking notes of what you took for your unique physiology. And I think I'm just going to exactly copy you.
I would say that's purely the input that's going to lead to the output and body fat distribution. If you see someone that has the physique that you want,
correct,
just do exactly what they do.
That is why if you Google or YouTube Chris Bumstead's steroid cycle, that's what everyone wants to do so they can look like Chris Bumstead.
That's a very real phenomenon that happens far too often.
It actually happens. So I guess I'm not even joking. I'm just legitimately serious. I'm not going to actually copy your regimen. But yeah, I take a very specific well, actually, it's not that specific. A very heaping scoop, which the scoop is 5 grams. So I take around 7 grams of creatine per day. That is 49 grams of anabolics per week just with my creatine.
So how do you calculate when you're going to run out? If one scoop may be a little bit higher, a little bit heavier one day, surely there's a day in there where like once every couple of months when your giant tub, I've seen the giant tub of creatine actually.
Oh, yes.
When it runs out, how do you know how long it takes you to reorder?
I stockpile it badly. I'm a creatine connoisseur. If I want the really granular creatine, then I do I think it's the NOW creatine. If I want the like kind of in-between creatine, then I do the NutriCost. And then if I want the top shelf creatine, it's literally like cake powder or cake flour. You know the difference between like a bread flour and a cake flour? Not Thorn. Gorilla Mind is the most powdery of powder.
Really?
Comes in the little containers, so you have to buy several of them at a time. But yeah, that's actually what my wife likes. So when I'm at home, then I'm taking Gorilla Mind creatine. That's the top shelf stuff. And then when I'm at work and I'm just getting my post-workout shake, then I'll suffer and choke down some granular creatine, along with a few other things as well.
Yeah, so let's talk about those other things. So they're not steroids yet.
SARMs.
But let's talk about taurine. So taurine as an anabolic.
Yeah, and I guess I could talk about this and beta-alanine kind of in the same vein because they're both amino acids, essentially.
They're both in your veins.
Yeah, so they are both in my veins. So yeah, I take about 3 grams per day of both the taurine and the beta-alanine. I combine all those kind of granular powders. The beta-alanine kind of gives you the tingles. I think Derek says it causes itching of the gluteal cleft. But in some people, and me, it doesn't. It kind of acts as a little bit of a stimulant, I think. But it helps with lactic acid buffering. And then taurine is kind of classic for back pumps. Again, my healthily unhealthy obsession for CrossFit, take that as you will. I get back pumps quite a bit, and taurine has made a big difference with that.
So the taurine is anabolic because it allows you to finish the workout without being debilitated by your back pumps. Is that the primary mechanism there?
For me, honestly, it probably is, sadly enough. Beta-alanine, I guess one thing that I left off was I do take magnesium malate and magnesium taurate from time to time. Taurate just is a little extra taurine. Malate might also help with the lactic acid buffer a little bit. Same thing as beta-alanine. I try to take it every single day so I'm consistent, and then both can build up in my system.
Yeah, and I've heard mixed reports on the magnesiums and the different types, but I think I've heard malate specifically, just anecdotally, people think that helps more with their DOMS, their delayed onset muscle soreness, so that you can go back the next day and train again. And like we said, the more you train, the more you recover, the more you can go train again, the more hypertrophy you're going to get.
Yep. And training regimens, we've briefly touched on them in the past. Our updated regimens are for another video, but I have been training 7 days a week recently. Not the same. I've been varying it as much as possible, but we'll touch on that later.
All right, so now let's talk about carnitine. So this is something over the counter. Derek with More Plates, More Dates has talked about this. I think you and I have made some posts about it. It's I guess a supplement that's marketed a lot of times as a fat burner, but it also is anabolic.
Yeah, I think if this is a fuel pump or like a little extra fuel injection, I guess you could say it helps me be fat adapted as well. But I do take oral L-carnitine most of the time. Occasionally I inject it. We've talked in other videos about like hair protocols and fertility protocols, so I won't bore people with that. But I suppose I could say, when I'm injecting HCG and FSH, often when I'm completely off testosterone, which is relatively frequent given my varicoceles and atrophy and whatnot. Again, we've talked about my history in other videos, but I like to combine my HCG, FSH, and carnitine actually in the same syringe. That way it also burns a little bit less, and inject that and I'm sure that does have performance enhancing benefits on top of the fertility benefit. So that's definitely a thing that some people can consider. But when I'm taking oral L-carnitine, I take as many forms as possible, not just acetyl L-carnitine, not just L-carnitine, L-tartrate. Life Extension has a good carnitine called optimized carnitine that has 3 different forms in it. And then, of course, Derek has a good carnitine, the 750 mg L-carnitine L-tartrate, packed into each little capsule. Combination of the 2 is what I take. So a total of about 7 grams a week, maybe 10 if I'm really pushing it.
Yeah, and I think that's a good recommendation. Anytime there's sort of purported benefits of one form of a supplement over another, magnesium is a great example. There's a lot of good magnesium blends out there as well. So the one thing that comes to mind with carnitine, and I'm actually talking about lean mass and lean mass hyperresponders jogged my memory on this. There was a paper looking at, I think it was a 2,000 milligram dose of oral L-carnitine, not in CrossFit athletes,
diabetics,
not in bodybuilders. I think they were either like prediabetes or metabolic syndrome or obesity, something like that. They weren't your healthy population, but they did seem to have a faster progression of atherosclerosis. So for the average person, I guess if they're like making a net improvement to their health, I wouldn't be opposed to it. But if it's someone who is, like a metabolic disaster as of right now, like you look at their blood work and you're like, hey, we've got big changes we need to make. L-carnitine is probably not the first thing I'm going to reach for.
Not the first thing. In specific cases, it can be used for fertility and PCOS. And then, of course, for short periods of time, 60 days, 90 days, to help with better motility of sperm. But a good way to tell if you're a healthy carnitine candidate is if you take it without any allicin or berberine or things that can prevent conversion of carnitine and choline to TMAO, and your TMAO goes up. That's probably due to an unhealthy gut microbiome. And I would postulate that if they accounted for TMAO levels in the study, and if it went up, then they stopped the carnitine, then it would not lead to progression of plaque, because those people also probably have metabolic syndrome.
Yeah, there's a million sort of tweaks to studies that have been done we'd like to see, and someday we'll be doing them.
Yeah.
But moving on from carnitine, let's talk about your omega regimen. So how many fish oils are you taking as supplemental? Because I know you're a canned fish enthusiast.
Yeah. If I have a can of herring, or if I have a can of salmon, or if I have a can of sardines, or if I have a can of mackerel, of which I do frequently consume those things, then often I do not take any omega supplement. So it's like I'm a natty when it comes to omegas. But really at least half the time, at least half the days, I'm taking about 2 grams of omegas, and about 2/3 of that is DHA, probably 1,300. And then about 1/3 of it is EPA, and then a little bit of DPA, a little bit of RALA as well.
Yeah, and that DHA EPA ratio seems a lot more similar to what you're getting in your canned salmon or canned mackerel. Things in nature you tend to see have a little bit more DHA than EPA in them, not 100% of the time.
Yeah, sometimes I also take prescription omega-3 ethyl esters, not the triglyceride form. I think both are fine in my case. If you're not going to consume any omegas in your diet, and you want to take omegas, let's say 2 days per week, at the esters are probably preferred. Longer half-life, essentially. Whereas otherwise, triglyceride form might be preferred, but both are fine. And if somebody's telling you it has to be one or the other, the more important thing is the form. We've actually done a full podcast on this. We can link people that.
Actually, yeah, great chance to plug that podcast. So take a listen if you want to hear more about omega-3s and omega-3 ratios.
Yep.
So now let's get into the fun stuff. Real steroids.
Yeah, so real steroids, I guess, other than dutasteride and finasteride, which I do not take during fertility phases. When I am on my, let's consider it health phase, I want to keep my LP(a) low. My starting LP(a) was around 100 nanomoles per liter. Yep. And I've gotten it down to into the 20s. Sometimes it goes into the 30s. In general, when I'm on my health phase, it's around 70 to 140 milligrams a week of testosterone cypionate, usually injected 3 times a week. Although if I'm on the higher end of that, I actually inject daily, 20 milligrams every day. That's if I'm really trying to, push things for health reasons, and definitely not because it would improve my performance in the gym or for CrossFit related activities, et cetera, et cetera.
Of course not. I mean, just like I read in my health textbook in high school, sometimes athletes will try to use these things to improve performance, but it just doesn't work.
Yeah, only 5 to 10%. Or are we saying 0%? I've heard 10%.
My health textbook said that they do not work.
Yeah. If you look at world records, let's say you assume that the individual that has the natural world record in whatever, powerlifting, Olympic lifting, whatever it is. Actually, throughout Olympic lifting, everybody's using PEDs there.
Yeah.
In whatever federation, natural, IPF, I forget which one's which. And then the untested world records are usually about, 10% more. The untested versus the tested. So the tested is probably using some PEDs. So you could say if you have someone who's optimal, natural, they probably have high testosterone or high growth hormone or just optimal hormone production naturally within reason.
And the right, limb length and body mechanics. You can put all those pieces together.
And then you can have the same exact person, except maybe they had optimal natural production. Maybe they didn't. Maybe they were like me and had varicoceles and bilateral atrophy. And, that's testicular failure. That's hypogonadism. If you do an ultrasound and you have atrophy before you've done anything, that's just what it is. Someone in my scenario is going to benefit a heck of a lot more than somebody with already completely optimal testosterone production. So some people it might help 5%, some people 10%.
So you would be a hyper responder.
Yeah.
Is that the word we're going to?
I'm a lean mass hyper responder
to testosterone.
And I respond very well, both from a lipid standpoint and an LP(a) standpoint and a training standpoint, energy standpoint, to all regimens, whether it is 70 milligrams a week, 10 mgs injected daily, whether it is 140 milligrams a week, whether it is 400 IU of HCG injected 3 times a week. I've responded quite well to all of those regimens.
And here's your pie chart. This is much more interesting to look at than mine because you have the nice colors and you can barely see it, barely make it out. You probably have to zoom in to see this, but between the orange triangle and the blue triangle, there's a little sliver there that represents testosterone.
Yep.
So it's a very small piece of the bigger picture, which I think is a great segue into talking about all these supplements are not going to make as much of a difference in your overall health compared to the actual exercise that you're doing. And that's why we need a pill that makes people want to exercise. Not a pill that gives you the results of exercise, but a pill that makes people exercise. Yeah,
and I think that the exercise and diet habits that I had, for lack of a better term, covered up potential hormone systems. Because as I've mentioned in previous podcasts, I was very upset when I optimized everything naturally and I saw what my best possible, if you will, total testosterone and free testosterone was, and also my DHT and SHBG and lipoprotein(a). And I'm glad that I've improved things from there. But I did make it a decent amount into my 30s before doing anything. So on one hand, I kind of wish I had started earlier, but on the other hand, I'm kind of glad that my lifetime exposure to I mean, with creatine and omegas, I do wish I had started those earlier. But with some of these
Yeah.
things, I didn't want to hyper complicate my 20s, if you will, when I didn't need to, and I had no acute concerns for fertility at that time.
Yeah, and it's going to be a variable response. Some people are testosterone hyper responders in terms of emotional sensitivity.
Yep.
So people are like, oh, I've got a high stress part of my life coming up. Maybe it's a job change, or maybe they're about to have their first child and they think, oh, I want testosterone to help me.
Yep.
That could be a particularly bad idea because it can cause irritability in some people at a time when you really don't want to be irritable.
Yeah. The way I kind of think of it is the highway of life. Sometimes there's traffic jams, sometimes there's not. It depends on where you're at in life. It also kind of just depends on what car that you've been provided with. But hormone replacement regimens, whether it's HCG or TRT or whatever it is, there is better and worse choices depending on the traffic jam that you're in. And there is more permanent ways to just completely lift you off the road and helicopter you along your way. And there's also ways to just kind of help you scoot by on an alternate route.
Yeah, I've never been in a traffic jam and thought to myself, boy, I wish I was on more testosterone right now.
I have been in a traffic jam and wished, boy, I wish I was not in a fertility phase and I was back on my dutasteride.
Yeah,
so
that's prefrontal cortex androgens.
That's some food for thought for future podcasts. I've also been in a traffic jam and thought, boy, I'm glad I'm not on Clomid, because then I'd be angry and crying at the same time.
Because of desmosterol.
Yeah.
No, that's an
don't
aside.
Don't read too much into that. Not everybody that takes Clomid or enclomifene is angry or crying.
But everyone that takes Clomid or enclomifene does have a rise in desmosterol.
Yeah. I was going to say just most of them, but...
Yeah, most of them. I think we've derailed that. But yeah, Clomid is, I guess, more infamous than testosterone for causing emotional sensitivity. Some people go through a honeymoon phase for a couple weeks or a month, and then longer ester build, or longer isomer, the zuclomifene builds up and starts to cause problems in some individuals.